let you guys take things away.
All right, thanks, Fred. Welcome us together here to talk about addressing. I want to set a couple things on the table so you know as we can move forward. I'm kind of fighting a cough today, so I'm going to do my best to get through that, but we may wind up taking more short breaks as a result of that and than we typically do. But we have lots of good content for you here today. My name is Jeff Ledbetter. I'm with the DataMark team of Michael Baker International. And I am a GIS nerd. Happy to be one, have been one for the better part of 22 years now. And I've focused on addressing and addressing for public safety for the better parts of the last 11 years. And so this has kind of become my passion project. And they said, do you have anything to do a workshop on? I said, I've got 4 hours on addressing. You think anybody will want that? They said yes. So I know that I recently presented part of this to a group from a northern Wisconsin user group. And some of you may be here. We had to really roll through that quickly there and didn't get to talk about all that we wanted to. So we're going to do a little bit more long form that today. And I am joined by my partner here, Mark Whitby. You want to introduce yourself, Mark?
Sure. Welcome, everybody. And like Jeff said, my name is Mark Whitby. I'm an ENP. I'm not a GIS geek. I know a little bit about GIS, so enough to be dangerous, but I spent most of my career in the PSAP. I spent 21 years working as a call taker, working all the way up to a director position. And then the last 10 years of my career, I got into MSAG, ALI, working with wireless providers. And then I got into GIS and I started working with addressing groups, all the different addressing authorities in the counties that I worked with. So I'm very fortunate to be presenting with Jeff and for you guys at this conference. So thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
The great thing about having Mark to tag team with on our team of experts is that he really does bring a practical application to it that I love sharing with GIS audiences, because very often we think of a lot of fine technical details. Sometimes we lose sight of how those GIS data are going to get used. And so Mark does a great job of bringing that reality to the table here. And I'm excited to have him show us some very specific public safety stuff. So let's just jump right into it here. Our agenda is going to discuss the history and legacy of addressing, the anatomy of an address, and then we're going to get to geek out a little bit about GIS, addressing in GIS. We're going to talk about parsing it in NextGen 911 in that section. Mark's going to give us a lot of great insight about MSAG and ALI and addresses in that section as well. And then we'll round the day out by talking about what is a master address database. We're going to use a case study from one of my projects to kind of demonstrate the value of this master address database approach. So I always like to get a feel for my audience. I see that we have, it was 17 of us. Well, we're up to 26 now. Let me pull that participant panel down here. I do want to say that this will be oh so much better if it is a conversation between you guys and us instead of us just talking at you. And so I encourage you to use the raise hand button if you have a question or a comment to make or a clarification to offer. Please just raise your hand on the Zoom interface. Mark and I will be monitoring it. As well, if you would like to make a comment via the chat box, that would be perfectly acceptable as well. And welcome again to make sure that we're answering your questions as they come. And if you have any points of clarification to offer, do so either one of those two ways, and then we should be able to unmute you, or I guess you guys, this is a meeting, so you can unmute yourself as well. So if anything comes up, please just raise your hand or make a comment there and make this a all-around conversation. So as I was starting to say, I always like to get a feel for who's in the audience. Nice big audience here. And this is a quiz time, which is a little bit challenged by the virtual delivery of this, though we could have done a Zoom poll, but I want to use the chat box for you to say a true or false for each of these as they come up. And nobody's going to grade you on this. Nobody's going to call your boss and tell you don't know what you're doing. So just drop in true or false into the chat box when we ask these questions. And what this will do is help me assess, what the level of understanding is already across this audience. And it'll kind of open up what we're going to be talking about today in our material. So the first question, true or false, addressing is a function of the US Postal Service. All right, I like that. Fast and decisive, false, false, false. That would be correct. US Postal Service delivers envelopes to boxes, not addresses to structures.
And it's funny because a lot of people think even back in the day that that's what the Postal Service did was assign addresses. And maybe in some areas of the country they might have, but it's been a long, long time since they've done addressing.
Yeah, that's right. The public doesn't realize that, but it's a fact. Okay, an address can be assigned to without a structure present. True or false? We got some truths, we got some falses. Some examples: hunting land, campsite, yada, yada, yada. I didn't know that you could address a yada, 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 but that's awesome.
Steinfeld would be happy, right?
Everybody that said true, I would agree with. Now, a couple of these questions are things that you can make a case against or for it, right? But I would certainly agree that you can make an address, assign an address without a quote unquote structure. Now, what's a structure, right? Does it have to have a roof to be a structure? Is it something other than the natural ground? Is that a structure? That's where the debate rings out, right? So the point being here is that you don't necessarily have to have a building in order to assign an address. And those are good examples: campsites, parklands, any kind of other, what in the Next Gen 901 is referred to as a non-addressed dispatchable location could be given an address as well, right? Because of the structure of the schema. So we'll get to talk a little bit about that. Next question. Addressing is mission critical to all government functions. True or false? Addressing is mission critical to all government functions. Have a lot of truths in there. I say true. The point of asking this question is to get you to think about, and you probably do because you've made these ROI, return on investment arguments for years around your GIS systems, is that basically everything that occurs in a government enterprise occurs at a point of service delivery. And that point of service needs to be located and tracked so that you can ensure effective and efficient point of service delivery. And so almost everything a government does occurs at a customer location. All right, sub-addressing isn't that important to maintain. You can have it, it's great, or you can not have it, and that's okay too. True or false? All right. Well, I love how everybody is in unison on these answers. That tells me we have a lot of well-informed folks in the audience here. Everybody says false. What's the comment here?
If it exists, it should be maintained, and that's true. And I know from the public safety side, sub-addressing is huge. Apartment complexes, mobile home parks, campgrounds. If there's a site or maybe like a marina has slips, somebody's going to get hurt. And if they're going to get hurt, they're going to call 911, and we need to be able to get our responders to that location. So having it in the GIS data is immensely helpful for the operators.
Right. And those are great examples, Mark, of exactly why everybody should be concerned about sub-addressing. Sub-addressing is a topic that a lot of people kind of feel like, oh, well, I don't have the resources to take care of, take care of sub-addresses. And that may be the case, but that doesn't mean that they're not critical and important, and that not worthy of, doing what you can to create it and maintain it, that it'll be useful in your data. Okay, great. So we have, Mark, a very in-tuned audience here that is going to understand what we're talking about, I think, a lot. And so we're going to learn from that quiz there about our audience and deliver some good information for you guys. So, excuse me. As to the history and legacy of addressing, this is kind of the fascinating part of the stuff for me, the material. Where did addressing come from? How did we get here where we land with these building numbers, road names, and all the different sort of ways we can parse and extend those addressing? If you go back to kind of the Middle Ages, right, in Western Europe, this idea of meeting at the Fox and Hound, their favorite pub, Fox and Hound kind of became their address, giving directions, right? Using landmarks as directions, turn left at the Windy Mermaid and then right at the Broken Wagon. All kind of came together around public gathering places like a pub or a public house. Later, as things moved forward, census, conscription, and tax collection became the real drivers for addressing. You have to know, what kind of citizenry you have to be able to field an army, and you have to be able to support the king. In order to do that, you have to know where the people with the money are in order to send them a bill, right? And that's kind of where those were the real drivers for the creation of address systems that we have today. Point of service delivery is another driver, as I mentioned earlier. The Pony Express needed to know where things were in order to deliver to them. Now, I love this sign from the Pony Express. It says, kind of makes a demonstration of how difficult the work was in the 1800s delivering hotshot packages, right? We want young, skinny, wiry fellas, not over 18. You must be expert riders and willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred.
I wonder if they got hazard pay for that,
Yeah, there's no death benefits to pay for orphans, so we like.
No, not at all. Yeah.
I love the heartfulness of that one. but have to be people that they have to know where they're taking a particular parcel, and so that they can drop it off in the right place. And then the evolution of this legacy system began, legacy systems, I should say, in one place, the Fox and the Hound, and another place, the Broken Wagon, started to kind of come together. There were grids around given jurisdictions, but those cities, those towns, those communities grew, and their grids started kind of colliding together. Their street names, street types, directionals start colliding together. And it doesn't really matter whether you're considering that from the perspective of, you know, Western Europe in the Middle Ages or the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is true, especially around metropolitan areas where there were lots of suburban towns with their own grids and their own street names, types, and directionals. And they started growing together, and their grids and street names and types and directionals started clashing together. Addressing authorities didn't necessarily have all the information they needed either. You know, the idea of the number of a lot in a given subdivision and the address that turns into are handled independent of one another across departments that don't necessarily come together and share the information, or haven't historically. Should be doing a better job of that now with better technology, but still don't. And there was no need to conform to stringent requirements. There were no standards or laws or regulatory requirements to do certain things. And so these systems evolved independently and without the benefit of technology or GIS. And so especially in a place like Wisconsin with centuries of history of kind of land ownership, land development, right? French and Spanish and British and American systems all kind of colliding. I think you guys probably have great examples of this happening. I grew up in Texas, where there was Spanish land grants that were later tweaked a bit into the Republic of Texas had their own systems. And so you had land ownership that you could go back to the Spanish land grants, other land ownership that came back to Texas land grants, and yet other sets of land ownership that came with township range and section of Jeffersonian and American location tracking as well. So I know that you guys have that same sort of mix, a similar sort of mix with all the various governing entities that kind of put their own grid in place. And then that history all becomes part of the address that you have today. So the current situation is that addressing is determined locally, for better or for worse. I mean, that's a good thing, right? Local determination is a good thing because there is the ability to be sensitive to local needs in determining these addresses. However, different localities determine them different ways and for different reasons. And so moving from one place in the world, I just moved to Kentucky from California a few months ago. Moving from the Western United States into Kentucky has been very different, even though a lot of the addressing systems are similar. There's a lot more history in a place like Wisconsin or Kentucky than there has been in a place like California. And so sort of historically things have been different, and you can see where those grids have collided more and more. So there's this patchwork of addressing systems, yet they are sufficiently standardized. And there's one thing we can probably say thank you to the USPS for. I'm generally not a great praiser of the USPS in these workshops, but this is one place where I think the USPS did do that, right? They standardized locations, and the zip code idea was wholly made out of USPS needs. And the idea that I can write a letter anywhere in the United States and I'm going to address it with the same components, which we'll look at in a second, largely comes from their standardization. There is the public perception that comes out of that fact that the USPS is somehow the addressing authority. And everybody here knows that that's not the case. The local addressing authority is the one that assigns addresses. And because there have been no standard systems of records for addressing, from place to place, they're very different. Not just in the actual addresses themselves, but how they've been memorialized. There in some places, lots of meets and bounds are required. Other places, meets and bounds are somewhere, but we don't know exactly where. And so there's kind of turned into that whole idea of these systems independently evolving and without the benefit of technology. And that still kind of remains the case, right? With this last bullet point, GIS, haves and have-somewhats and the have-nots that are managing then this information or this data, depending on where you fall on that have-nots scale. You're managing this information or this data in different ways, breaking it down differently, parsing it differently. And that leads to challenges when something like a next-gen 911 system is envisioned. And a key component of it is this addressing data in a standardized format. Not scary or unachievable at all, but it represents a lot of work to do to get it into the right formats. And that is our current situation. So let's get into the anatomy of an address. Again, you guys probably know more about this than even I do, but I want to make sure that we cover the basics, right? The goal of an addressing system is to create a set of rules and guidelines that are geared toward public safety and usability, right? The addressing of structures, right? Or not structures, as we discussed briefly earlier. Homes, businesses, other structures, other sort of landmarks even, must follow an easy to comprehend and logical numbering system. And there are different ones. Should be easy to update and maintain. That's a challenge. In a place with this much history, as we've talked about, as Wisconsin, the ability the challenges of updating and maintaining, addressing across different systems, I'm sure you guys have felt. So which do you use? Talk a little bit in the chat box if you want to, or raise your hand and tell us about your grid systems, your interval-based systems, distance-based systems, or combination systems. Anybody want to brag? City style blocking grid. Okay, great. Grid systems are not something that I've had a tremendous amount of experience with because I know they're difficult. I've kind of been happy that I haven't had a lot of experience with a lot of grid systems, but I feel like in some older places, that's probably much more common. Okay, great, thanks for the interaction there. Pure grid systems establish a northern and eastern coordinate system for municipality and origin point, right, with an XY. Numbers tend to get large. If the municipality covers a large area, other numbers may be needed to indicate the sector of the grid. Now, there was a grid system in Fresno, California that was really a very impressive grid system. If you could understand how to read the grid system, you could hear somebody's house number and know exactly where within the city that house was located. Now, I don't know how many people could actually read it because it was pretty complicated to learn and you'd have to know that there would be some benefit to learning it. So I don't think a lot of people took advantage of that, but grid systems can be very good, right? Because they have predictable locations. And like I said, reading the house number could tell the location relative to the parts of the city where a given home is at. These grid systems, here's an example. These grid systems, you know if your house number is 1120, it's going to be in the lower, the sort of southwestern part of the town. If your origin point is over here, but it kind of gets complicated when you're on this circular thing. So it works really well in flat areas with almost no curved roads, because you get these complicated blocks where you go from 7775 to 11,049, and then all of a sudden I've got two odd addresses on different sides of the street because where they fall in a grid. That's not very intuitive to me. I know a lot of people love their grid systems, and if you're good at it, you should definitely stick with that because you figured it out. There aren't a whole lot of locations where that meet this sort of discussion about, or this sort of description of being flat areas with almost no curved roads.
And going from a 4-digit number, like Jeff was saying, to a 5-digit number for public safety, that can be kind of confusing, not just for the responder, but the dispatcher, especially dispatchers, because a lot of times dispatchers have a lot of turnover. Mm-hmm. And so you have new dispatchers and you're trying to teach them, okay, this is how we do our addressing. We use a grid system, so this is how we do it. It takes a while to really grasp that, even with technology the way it is now, where we're using electronic maps and not paper maps, right? But sometimes responders, maybe your fire department's tied up in a huge fire, and they're bringing in responders from other areas that maybe aren't used to a grid system, and they're looking for a 5-digit number, and they're driving down the street and it's 4-digit, 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 oh, 5-digit. Wait a minute, did I just drive off the end of the earth, or is it flat or what? So it can be kind of confusing. So.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark, is that the ability to quickly read and understand kind of relatively well where a location is really important part of a dispatcher's job. And this little distinction here, this little curved road here, if it was the only curved road, could be remembered as an anomaly. Right. But if there's a bunch of them, it could really cause some trouble with, oh, I thought you're on this part of town, but in fact you're in this part of town. Right. For confusion for both responders and dispatchers. Not even to mention like the other people that deliver things that aren't as emergent, right?
Right. If I can't get my pizza, or my Amazon package, we're going to have some problems, right?
Exactly. So the sort of alternative to that, or another very prevalent system, is a distance-based addressing system. Distance-based addressing establishes house numbering according to the number of increments from the beginning of a block. These increments can be anything that an addressing authority wants them to be. 5 foot, 10 foot, 5.28 feet is 1/100th of a mile per number. So that means there's 100 addresses in a mile. 26.4 feet is 5/100ths of a mile. So in that case, there would be 500 addresses in a mile. Did I do that right? My math may not be right today. Yeah, that's right. And then 52.8 is one. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't, my math is wrong. 5.28 feet would be 1,000th of a mile. Right. So there's 1,000 addresses in a mile. 5,000 addresses, 26.4 feet. And then 100 addresses in a mile and 52.8 feet. So I feel like logically I failed you guys, and something I just said wasn't right there, but I look at, excuse me, I see a common use of the 5.28 feet out in the places that I work with clients in, and they've got 1,000 addresses in a mile. So you think about how far a mile is. Your typical suburban or urban block is much less than that, than a mile, but they still have 100 addresses you typically in the block, right? But they'll increment still based on 5.28 feet, even though they may bump up the next block. So this is where this is a system that isn't without its own issues as well, of course. Parity is really important and is established according to movement along the road from the origin to the completion of the road, so that excuse me, typically in those situations, odd numbers are on the left as you ascend from the origin to the completion, even numbers on the right. Some people are confused about how that can be intuitive, but you have to know where you're at on that segment as you roll down it. Are my numbers increasing or decreasing? If they're increasing, even is typically on the right, odd typically on the left. That's not always the case, though. That's something that widely varies. Excuse me. Address numbers themselves should be assigned to all structures which are inhabited or are the point of delivery of something. That's another interesting topic. Where do I assign a number? I found in my experience lots of different criteria for that. Is where it's inhabited. It's maybe where there's a service being delivered. So where there's an electrical meter, which would include emergency power drops for traffic and things like that. Might be where there's a water meter, might be where there's accessory dwelling units get their own numbers. There's lots of peculiarities and reasons why you may have a whole address number or even a partial address number, things like that. Many lots have more than one structure, which can be dealt with by sub-addressing or multiple house numbers. And corner lots are interesting as well because they should be assigned a number according to the frontage of the main entrance or where the driveway meets the road. No, I just moved into a new home. It's on a corner lot. My garage, my driveway, right, coming out of my garage, is on a street on the side of the front of my house. So even according to this definition, the addressing authority could have addressed me off of the front of the house or addressed me off of the side of the house where the driveway connected to the street. I think they did the smart thing and did it to the front of the house so that it's a little bit more predictable, but by this definition, they could have done either thing.
Yeah, and I know corner lots are always a challenge for, addressing authorities. So I've seen in some places where they actually assign 2 addresses to a corner lot. And then based on the orientation of the house, right, then the developer decides which one, and then you make the other one like, you don't delete the address, but you make it inactive. So if they ever change the house, right, tear it down, demolish it, turn it, you already have another address assigned, so you don't have to worry about scrambling.
I think that's what Lori here actually is making a specific comment on. She said, just say no to corner pre-addressing because it's the equivalent of drugs, right, Lori?
Exactly.
So many headaches. Yes, so corners are always a fun topic on address numbers. And I think you're right, Lori. It really should depend less on what it could be, because it could be a couple things like you just described, Mark,
Mhm.
or about what it actually is when the structure gets built. That makes a lot of sense to me. And then again, a typical address format, everybody knows this: a house number, street name, street type. When we get into Mark's discussion on parsing, we'll see that there's actually many possibilities for street types, both pre and post,
Mhm.
with the city, state, and then a postal code. This is really just a nod to the fact that if you want to ship or deliver mail, you'll need this, but the addressing authority, again, doesn't rely on the postal office. I'm actually going to stop right there and take a quick break. So let's do a 5-minute break. It is 1:36 here. Let's be back in place here at 1:41. I'm going to go get some more water here and prevent myself from coughing at you some more.
Sounds good.
All right. So we'll be back at 1:41.
I'll run a little video for everyone then. Okay.
Okay, great. Let me stop sharing here. All right. Yeah, everybody, just another 30 seconds here. All righty. Thanks for that quick break. To adhere, address numbers, primary numbers should not be longer than 6 characters. Now look, this is a best practice. See my best practice stamp? I don't have any authority to tell you these things are like law or anything like that. But I say that because life is a lot less challenging when you don't have a whole lot of complexity. Let me get my chat box over here. Sorry. There it is. And when you get more than 6 characters, you wind up with dashes and numbers and letters. And I know that there are some peculiar address numbers in Wisconsin or road names that are complicated. And I can't claim to fully understand those. So these next few slides in some of your cases may not even be something you can achieve because of the history and legacy of addressing that you already have. So I'd love to hear about some of that. If you guys think it's appropriate at any point, just pop your hand up and you want to tell us all about it. That'd be great. One of my best practices is there should be no fractional data addresses. These exist virtually everywhere, and so this bullet point is often unachievable as well. That said, though, this is hard to maintain in a database. That's also happens to be a math equation. I think everybody knows that, right? That fractionals are math equations. Math equations are difficult to attach to whole numbers in databases. You guys are a bunch of GIS nerds like me, so you understand that. Alphanumeric address numbers should not be used. I think this is where we get a little bit complicated in Wisconsin. You guys tell me. Thomas said all too well. Again, you complicate yourself in a GIS database when you put leading letters onto numbers. It's not the end of the world. You can get around it. But why would you kill yourself if you didn't have to? Hyphens should be avoided, right? And I think that's another Wisconsin peculiarity, right?
And from the public safety point of view, like when you're using a 1/2, you really can't put that into a CAD system. So I know in the last agency I worked at, if we had a 1/2 address, we would use the letter H. So it would be 101H Main Street in the example that Jeff has on the screen, just so it would go into the CAD system. Some places will use like a 0.5 just to get it through CAD. Same thing with alphanumeric addresses, a combination of both back and forth. Dashes are another one. So we've had to manipulate CAD systems to be able to take some of these things. But if you think of it this way, we're kind of giving you some ideas of what not to do in the future so you don't bring in any new ones, right? So if you're looking at developing addressing standards or how are we going to address in our county or our municipality, these are some things to think about.
Yep, that's a great comment. Thank you, Mark. Significant leading zeros and primary and secondary numbers should not be used. Again, complicating yourself in your database. And I've never understood how this is beneficial, but there's plenty of places where it's necessary. One letter road names should not be used. I know there's a ton of places out there that have alphabet streets, right? It's not the end of the world, but again, it just, it's going to complicate your life. If you don't have to do it, you shouldn't. Common practice is the number from east to west, from south to north. Again, this is like a lot of places have it this way, so I've kind of added it, but there's no written rule about this, right? Could be that this is true and it could not be that this is true, and you're not going to die. Where one road starts and ends at points on a second road, creating a loop, the numbering along the two roads should be in the same direction. So I need to make a graphic for this. I peeled this out of actually a NINA recommendation for addressing. But basically it's just saying that where roads kind of do that loop thing that happens from time to time, try to be consistent from part of the loop to the other part of the loop about things flipping around. So if even is always on the right as you're driving from a start point to an end point, and make sure you just keep the evens on the right, I think is my recommendation here. Somebody, Thomas had a comment. What was it? Someone who is not a Wisconsin native, the practice of alphanumeric county highways names irritates me. Okay, county highways are all alphanumeric designations. Okay, so there you go. That's where you can't even escape it, right? In Wisconsin. So just pretend like I didn't show you the slide for that reason alone, right? I know, sigh. That's there's local peculiarities everywhere. I think you have some of the worst ones, but they're everywhere. That made you feel better, didn't it? When it comes to cul-de-sacs, here's another example where even and odd, as you're proceeding from the point of beginning to the point of completion, it evens on the right, odds on the left. And then what do you do about this guy that's always at the end of the cul-de-sac? Is he odd or even? Well, I guess whatever the addressing authority thinks of that day, right?
Right.
Depends on how it hits them. So all of these things wind up being somebody's judgment, right? Because there is no uniform standard for how these things should be done. There might actually be, there obviously is some sort of requirement in Wisconsin that, what was it, that the county highways are alphanumeric designations. I'm sorry, all alphabetic designations. And it's thorn in some of your sides, and others probably just are laid back and deal with it, right? Without complaining. But all of this points out the fact that even if we try to kind of have like rules about a system, there's always a situation like this where somebody just has to make a decision. Somebody just has to pick something, right? You just have to pick either 13 or 14. And somebody makes the pick, and then everybody throws peanuts at that person for the next however long that address is around. And they say, why did they do that? Well, they just had to make a choice. So there's as much art to addressing as there is science, more probably art than science in addressing, despite the sort of the desire to kind of have this idea that addressing is this nice, clean, rules-based thing. And I can predict my location, I can predict where I'm going. I can make things more intuitive or less intuitive, but I still have to train you on that intuition, right? So at some point, the local addressing authority just has to pick something. And you happen to live in a place where they picked a lot of crazy things. Sounds like a sigh is worthy of that, Thomas. So let's talk about what NINA, the National Emergency Number Association, they are the standards making body for 911. they are not a standards making body for address numbers, but they've made some recommendations so that for public safety purposes, these things might be a little bit smoother, and they're good recommendations. So I want to share those again as best practices, the recommendations. Again, back to the distance space interval system. Nina recommends 5.28 feet, 1,000 unique numbered addresses per mile. There's again 5,280 feet in a mile. So every time you move 5.28 feet, you'll increment up one, which means across the typical suburban lot, 50 foot of frontage. I don't know if that's typical either. It's probably not a typical suburban lot. But if it has 50 foot of frontage, you would increment the next house 10. Okay. So easy for an emergency service provider in the event of an emergency to look at the address and quickly figure out how far down the road the house is located. This all sounds good, but then it falls apart when you have big, long roads with not that many structures, or you have big, long driveways. The bigger issue then is less about where the structure is and more about where the point of ingress is. So even these recommendations have their challenges. For example, if an ambulance were dispatched to 500 Alpine Lane, it would need to travel exactly 1/2 a mile to locate the house structure number 500. It sounds good, right, on paper, and it is good and easier for first responders because when they get trained that way. Structures can be assigned an address every 10.5 feet in this case of a 5.28 foot interval, and it allows for future development of a community. So it allows, there's plenty of infill numbers there between the structures. So the addressing authority, local standards are a customization of nationally recommended methods. So in other words, what I'm saying there is that some of these best practices should be brought together into a local standard. Local standards don't exist everywhere. They don't exist in a lot of places, but where it's possible, there should be some local standards, and there should be some regionalization of approaches where there's lots of cities next to each other in metropolitan areas. There should be some regionalization of approaches and addressing standards sought where possible. We're currently doing a project for LA County in California. Los Angeles County has more than 10 million inhabitants, has 88 cities in the county. That far outstrips a lot of states, right, in terms of the amount of population and the amount of constituent cities that are in it. Their attempt at regionalizing their addressing standards right now is what we're helping them with. And it's a big, big challenge. Even in a place that's as compact with that many people and 88 cities is a big challenge because there's 88 opinions about what should be in this and what they should be required to do or not required to do. And the fallback position is to make it maybe some best practice recommendations or a starting point for a standard, and each city gets to sort of create their own policies or procedures around them. One of the best recommendations we can make, and I'm sure, Mark, you've seen this, is to establish address review committees with stakeholders, addressing stakeholders such as public safety or 911, planning department, public works, utility providers, USPS should be on that list. And if a developer wants to give a certain lot a certain address or a certain road a certain address range, then it should go through this committee. There's a lot of people out there with some ideas about numerology and things like that, that the number on your house really matters. It makes it a lucky house or an unlucky house, or, makes events in their lives easier or harder. And I don't have any judgment for that idea, but there's should be this group in place to stop people from throwing in an 888 on a 7,000 block, right? Because that would really mess things up if you were on a 7,000 block and then all of a sudden you were looking for the 888 in the middle of the 7,000 block, because you'd probably be 6,200 blocks back, right? Looking for that 888 structure.
Exactly. Well, I can give a good example of an addressing authority group, because the county I worked at before I started with Datamark is called Pinellas County. So it's St. Petersburg, Florida, Clearwater Beach, Florida. A lot of people know where that is. There were 24 municipalities and addressing authorities in that county. And I worked for the 911 center and our regional 911 center. So every 911 call in Pinellas County went to our PSAP. And then we dispatched all the fire departments in the whole county. But then there were 4 police departments that we would transfer the call to for law enforcement. Like if they had a stolen vehicle and it was a certain city, we would transfer it. Well, I started this addressing authority group and we brought in these municipalities, these addressing authorities. We brought USPS, we brought the property appraiser, we brought our GIS team, we brought our planning department. So we had a good group of stakeholders. And then what I always told them is, before you officially sign that address, run it by me first. Let me be your quality assurance per se. And I would look and double check, is it even on the even side versus odd on the odd side? Is it in the right block range, just like Jeff was saying? So I would almost be their check and balances. And then once they assign that address, they would send out the information. And then I would be on that distribution list. So that way we weren't giving an address and then I turn around and go, no, you can't give that address. It's not in the right block range, or you can't use that street name. We had a street name approval process. And one of the other things that was really interesting is we started covering a lot, talking about NENA standards. Like there's one called the Site Structure Address Point document from NENA. Very good document. It gives you some pros and cons for each way of assigning an address, either actually putting the point on the GIS map, and it talks about things like corner lots, cul-de-sacs, right? Non-dispatchable locations, actual range versus theoretical ranges. So having that authority, that addressing group and everybody working together for these standards, you may come up with an ordinance that is now used in that county or maybe even in that region that kind of gives you some good workflows, some good practices, and it's a very good thing. So if you haven't done anything like that, that's something to think about.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what my experience with it, I was working for a 911 network in Houston when I had some experience with it, being a constituent on such a committee, was that sometimes the people at the cities needed to have that unified voice of authority behind it to be able to resist the silliness. And they would actually come to us and say, I don't want to approve this, and I'm not going to, but I really need you guys to send me a letter telling me why, so that I got some cover when I don't approve it. That happened on a fairly regular basis. So having this sort of established group and review committee can give you some teeth and some backup that maybe you don't have now, to kind of prevent some of those issues from happening. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about peculiar issues in rural areas and urban areas. And I know that we probably have people from all of those types of areas. So I want to hear some of your stories either in the chat box, or again, feel free to raise your hand on these particular issues. But in the rural areas, long driveways may upset addressing system intents. And that's what I was referring to earlier, where a structure may actually be a lot closer to a certain road, but it's addressed off of the road that you would access the property on. But that may be a mile or two away. It may require different number incrementation because of that. It may actually address it off of something different. You may vary off of your system because of that fact. And it may need that 528 feet increment instead of a 5.28 feet increment if you're out in the rural areas, because there just aren't as many structures. You may need to bump out your ranges on your road center lines to reflect that. Yeah, give them a little more range out in the rural areas. Establishing a signage standard becomes really critical in those areas too, so that when these long driveways or whatever happen, that you have a signage standard that would address the issue at hand and make sure that signage is communicative of all the things it needs to communicate. Let's see. Did have a comment here. Long driveways can create a lot of issues. Yes. Anybody have any specific rural issues you want to talk about? Again, you can throw your hand up or you can chat it out. Unnamed roads, private roads, roads named by residents. I remember a story when I was in Houston. This was a rural area as well, where somebody had their family compound. They put up a couple good mobile homes on the compound, and they put a little private road in between them all, and they want to call it Lone Star Road. And this is another example of where USPS, they don't care. They don't care what the name of the road is, right? So they started delivering to this Lone Star Road. But when they called 911, there was no such thing as Lone Star Road in our database because it didn't exist to anybody except them and the USPS. And I remember they got real mad on the recorded phone call. Well, the USPS delivers my mail here. They said, well, we don't have that road. So you're going to have to tell us some cross streets so we can figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Later, that turned into a big to-do about, okay, why couldn't I find this person? Was it that we didn't have it? And we dug into all the records and realized that, A, there was no dedicated road there of any name, right? Much less the one that they chose. And that, yeah, there you go. Vanity names should be banned. I agree with that. And because that's exactly what happened there.
Yeah, I like this other comment. The driveway is in one fire district, the house is in another district.
Yep, that happened.
And it's amazing how they can divide that. When I worked in Temple Terrace at the police and fire department, we had a plaza. It had multiple businesses, and the bar that was in the middle of the plaza, the boundary line went right through the middle of the bar. Half of it was Tampa for Tampa Fire, Tampa Police. The other half was Temple Terrace.
Nice.
So we were like, okay, if you're by the pool table, okay, you're safe because we're coming. But if you're near the bar itself, that's where you get Tampa Police, and it takes them longer to respond. So it's like, who thought of that? Why don't we just annex the rest of that property, right? Or in this case, maybe one fire district should say, look, I'm not going to respond to a fire on the driveway, and here's a patient 10 feet in, it's another fire district. Let's just make that all one fire district, right? Move the boundary, which would make a lot more sense, right?
Oh, yeah. Thomas is talking about rule route numbers.
Uh-huh.
Those definitely should not be allowed to continue.
Yeah, they've been around for a long time in a lot of areas, right?
Yeah. And when E911 was established, in most places, those were given actual house numbers, but apparently in Illinois, there's some areas that aren't. And that wouldn't surprise me.
Well, it's amazing. If you look at, there's a lot of places that are still just using 911, not enhanced. They're not getting any alley information on their 911 screens. It's basic 911 service. A lot of places out west, there's a couple counties in Georgia, and there could be places in, in Illinois or Indiana
Yeah.
or Wisconsin that could have that. It's kind of incredible.
Yep. Let's see, what's this one? A municipality that at one time did their own addressing, then turned the addressing responsibility to the county, and having to deal with different addressing systems within a small area. Yes, readdressing is highly disliked.
Yes.
Trying to accommodate the messy and inconsistent system is a nightmare. That's a story right there.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, everywhere is somebody having to deal with what the address used to be, the system used to be, annexed, de-annexed, whatever. Everybody who's sat in the seat dealing with these addresses has come up against something like that, and that's a nightmare, indeed. I certainly had plenty of that when I worked in Houston. But I wasn't even the addressing authority. I was just the aggregator of the data. So I always did go in again, sort of with the teeth of 911. I was able to say like, hey, this is going to bring a public safety problem for you if you don't fix your address. And often people would listen to that, and many other times they wouldn't. Right? And I had nothing other than my good looks and their goodwill to kind of get them to agree to it. So we didn't change that many addresses as it turned out. But yeah, these rural addressing issues can be complicated and frustrating. There are some urban suburban addressing issues that are kind of the opposite, that can be frustrating and difficult as well. Compact address ranges make infill addressing difficult sometimes. Actual versus theoretical address ranges in data management. And there's always a fun debate to be had there. An actual address range would show that the houses go from 4 to 38 on this stretch of road versus a theoretical, which may show going from 0 to 99. There's infill addressing is complicated, like I said, and continuity with adjacent jurisdictions, which is kind of that story that's being told in the comments, where it was addressed for one given system, then the city annexed it and things developed and built, and they had to kind of iron out a new addressing system, but still accommodate the old ones that were kind of grandfathered in. Annexations are an issue, a big issue in the urban areas. Any other urban specific thing? You got some comments here?
Yeah, I like the comment about how might the perspective of restaurant delivery rideshare services inform municipal service location data? Well, one thing I know in Hillsborough County where I worked, they actually created an app that you could report things like maybe an address not on the map, an address out of range, potholes, all kind of different services, and it would go to almost like a 311 type database. And then they would send it to where it needed to go. So in our 911 administration office, we did all the addressing. It would come to us and we would go, oh, okay, well, there's an address that's missing, or maybe we had it in the system as 100 and it's really 1100. So we fat fingered an address, right? Sometimes municipalities can do that with different apps, or just a way that they can communicate. So like, hey, here's a new street and it's not on your map, your county map, a new subdivision. We can go in and research it and then add it to our database.
So if you live in a place where your Uber Eats is always misdelivered, they could just go to the app and get that base. That's
well,
cool.
Maybe, because I know like Google's a big one. You know, a lot of people look at Google and go, oh, well, that's not right. Well, sometimes you can submit through, you know, the Google Map interface and say, no, this is my real address is this. You guys have it listed wrong, and they'll go in and update it.
Yep. Google is a big one. Let's see, what else we got here? Owner want address coming off of more prestigious street, right? That's right. That goes back to that numerology comments earlier about, I had to deal with a lot of those where people wanted 888 was what sticks in my head, because in a lot of Asian cultures, that's a good number, 888. And they were trying to put them in ranges that could squeeze it in there. Let's see, city here. We have addressing authority in our municipality. The county told me I can't assign an address because it doesn't exist in USPS. Oh no. That's a
The
forehead.
next line is true. I told them I inform USPS of the address. Exactly.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, it's not the other way around, right?
Still makes it through to the 911 database, but doesn't push through to the tax records. So there are 2 address styles floating out there. Oh,
Yeah, that's scary.
that's a problem. And the only thing you can do, I think, in that case, Lori, is just continue to hound them, right? But you've got other things to do with your life than continuing to call the tax people or the 911 people and go, hey, this is different.
Yeah, and having a really good distribution list. So when you assign a new address or a new street, making sure you have a good distribution list so it goes to people like 911, the tax collector, property appraiser, the phone companies, the electric companies, the postal service, right? So all that information, everybody gets it at the same time, or like Jeff will be talking about later, we're going to have a master repository of addresses. Why are we all not using the same database, right? There you go.
That's exactly right.
Good to hear, Lori, that you're good at hounding. That's awesome. Stick with it. That persistence is important.
All right. Well, I think this is another really good break point. So let's go ahead and just take a little bit of a break here. Let's come back at 2:20 and we'll start talking about managing addressing in GIS.
Sounds great.
All righty. Give me this. I'll stop the share and you can show the video again.
All right.
All righty.
That jumps back. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Took me a little bit longer to get back. Okay, so my favorite topic now. Managing addressing in GIS. First, there's the idea that a plan, I'm sorry, yeah, no, hold on, I didn't say that right. How's it go? A desire without a plan is just a wish. That's what I was trying to say. So you really have to think about, how am I going to manage these addressing in a GIS? And so there's some planning that has to go on. Some important philosophical questions you have to answer in order to figure out how to configure a GIS system to manage addressing. First of all, you really need to think about, are we going to do parcel-based addressing or structure-based addressing? Now, parcel-based addressing is really kind of very prevalent, right, in a lot of GIS data systems out there, because parcels are very prevalent. They've been developed first because, thinking back on why we address in the first place, election, right? And so the tax collectors have had the dollars to go out and develop important data sets such as parcels. Parcels are critical data sets because they do bring in the revenue that funds other things. And so there is some addressing that goes along with that, some what I'll call situs addressing. But there's lots of, you call it anything you want to, right? But that's a parcel-based address. Well, parcel-based address does really well when you have to be right once a year, and that is once a year to send out the tax bill, right? And it's more about mailing the bill to the person that can mail back the payment than it is about the actual location of the parcel, or the address of the parcel. And what if a parcel has more than one structure on it? That parcel-based address is not very useful for public safety purposes, not very useful for utility purposes, not very useful for any other sort of, well, in that case where there's multiple structures, service delivery uses, such as, again, utilities and things like that. So some people are happy with their parcel-based addressing, and other people acknowledge that public safety and the point of service delivery may demand a level deeper, which is structure-based addressing, which would address each of the structures separately, or at least with sub-addressing. So those things can be delivered, right? The services are delivered, public safety services among others. You have to think about things like, well, am I going to track the actual ranges of my road center lines? Because I need a geocoder to get me really precise locations? Or am I going to be happy because of the volume of my data, the number of records I'll have to maintain? Am I going to be happy, and is the geocoding going to be good enough if I do a 1 to 99 range on given blocks? Actual ranges, like I said, are going to provide you better geocoding results, but that's a lot of work. If you live in a place that's all developed out, there aren't new roads coming in, and you have lots of good resources to manage actual ranges, it's definitely the best thing to do. But in most realities, the number of records to maintain are high, and the number of resources of GIS experts and people to maintain them are low, right? So theoretical address range is a good compromise to kind of allow you to do good enough, right? So that's just, there's cases to be made for both of these things, just like there's cases to be made for both of these things. How many addressing authorities are going to be in this database? If I work for a city, there's only one addressing authority, but if I work for a county, there's unincorporated area, and then there's the cities that are inside the county that have their own addressing authorities that maybe you're having to coalesce or aggregate data from. You want to embrace strategery. Strategery isn't actually a word, but I like it because it just indicates that even that there's more art than there is science to strategy, just like there is to addressing. So you really want to think through these things and make a plan, and plan your schemas and all of the database elements around what you decide on not only these questions, but other strategic questions. Let's see, there was a question here. Briefly describe the difference between the actual and theoretical ranges. Yeah, absolutely. So the actual and theoretical address range, I should create a graphic on this too. Kid just drove by my window there on the back of on a toboggan on the back of an ATV. Sorry, that was distracting. Actual and theoretical ranges. So again, an actual range would be one that notes that the first house on the block starts with 4, and the last house on the block is number 38. So if I'm managing actual address ranges, I'm managing 4 to 38. Whereas if I use a theoretical address range, I'm using from 1 to 99. 4 to 38 still occurs within 1 to 99, but I don't have to understand that the highest number on the block is 38 in order to assign that 99. If I have a database like I had in Houston that had 250,000 road centerline segments on it, I need theoretical range management because I was coordinating something like 175 cities or addressing authorities that had those 250,000 road center lines, but none of them, some of them did and some of them did not have the ability to manage their roads. So I managed some of their roads for them. I didn't have the ability to go in and drive the streets in each of those cities and know that the highest number was 38 on this one, and it was 54 on this one, it was 23 in this one. So I did theoretical address range management 1 to 99 on every block. Now it was whatever the number of the block was, 2,500 to 2,599. But that's the difference. Question, follow-up question. So if there is a mile stretch with 2 addresses in the middle, the actual would just be low, high for those 2. So the reason why an actual address range yields a better geocoding result is that if the range was 4 to 38 and I was looking for 24, mathematically along that segment, it's going to put 24 about 2/3 of the way up the line, right? But if that range was 1 to 99, 24 would be 24% up the line, to about 1/4 of the way up the line. So there's a good distance between 1/4 of the way and 2/3 of the way that is the difference between a tighter geocoder and the less tight, less precise theoretical range management. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question here. Maybe Fred, there's a better way to do it, but the actual would just be the low high for those 2. I think the answer is no. Not sure I understand the question. Yeah, the actual address range, right, gives you a better geocode location. but it's a higher load of management, which is why it's on the planning tab here, or the planning slide, is showing that the best geocoding results are going to come out of that actual range management. But the actual range management, the level of effort to get that actual range management may be so high that it's unattainable. In many cases, it will be. In many other cases, if you, I'm working with the city of Santa Monica, which is also a part of LA County. They're all built out, right? And their only addresses coming in are accessory dwelling units now. And they're not that big anyways. It's about 5 square miles. So they've got about, I don't know, I think 10, 12,000 road centerline segments. They've got a couple of GIS analysts to attack it. And they're going through and changing from theoretical to actual ranges because they can drive out to the sites, note the highest address, come back and update their data. And it's only going to take them a few months to get that done. So because of the size of their data set, because of the nature of their fully built out city, and it's not going to change that much, they calculated that they could take that level of management on. But a lot of cases, most cases, I think in the world, there's more management to do than there are resources to do them. And there's more growth and more change constantly than that. So I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, let's keep talking about it. Okay, good. All right. So those are the kind of things you need to think strategically about. There's more than likely some very local things on here that you need to think about strategically as well that I haven't listed. So you'll want to undertake a planning process before you get into it if you haven't already. If you don't already have an address database, you'll want to think about things like this. All right. What are the roles of managing GIS data? What you see on the right is a graphic called, out of a business tool called a RACI chart. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. But what are the roles? There's roles like data owner, data stewards, editors, reviewers and approvers, observers, or people who could contribute observations about the field so that the editors can make edits. Who's the right department that owns the address point? It would be the actual addressing authority. The data stewards may be somebody who can edit the GIS data, but they don't actually own the GIS data. Maybe a GIS department that's working on behalf of or in partnership with the planning department, who maybe is the addressing authority. You have to think about all of these things. Who are going to be the people that contribute to my data? Who are the people that can actually have rights to edit it? Who are the people that are going to approve those edits, or at least be responsible for everything that happens, right? So you'll have to think about roles. You'll have to think about data quality. Data quality kind of comes in 5 phases: availability, completeness, accuracy, timeliness, and consistency. Is the data available? Is it even out there? Am I going to have to create it? Once I get it, is it complete? Does it have all the necessary data present? And does that data reflect the real world? Is it accurate to the real world? And then when changes come in, is the data available when it's needed? And then finally, is that data consistent throughout other systems, or even consistent between records? Do I have duplications? Do I have redundancies in data? Is it consistent? So you have a lot to think about with data quality. Generally speaking, if you're building a data set from scratch or from other data sources, but you're turning it into your own data set, you can think of 1, 2, and 3 as being like the building phase, and 4 and 5 being your maintenance phase. Do you have the structures, the business processes, the technology structures in place to timely manage and update the data and keep it consistent between consuming systems? One tool that's really good for data quality analysis is called fishbone analysis. In this particular sphere, fishbone can mean a lot of different things when you're thinking about data analysis, data quality analysis, but specifically around addressing, fishbone analysis is the comparison of data of the placed address point, right? Or the point itself, and then the location that the geocoder would put it along the road center line. When you connect those up, you get this rich set of data which you can use to do some analysis. Especially you want to analyze against intersections, right? So if you ever have intersections on fishbones, there's something in the data that's not right. Either intersecting another fishbone, which would mean that the placed address points, in this case, are out of order, right? That's what that would indicate, that it placed 175 here and 180 here. If you have a fishbone intersecting another road segment, if there was an intersection here and another road segment came through here, it would flag these fishbones to say, wait a minute, there's a problem. And then if you fat fingered a directional or anything like that, you get these wild fishbones that visually very quickly just tell you like, oh, okay, there's a problem here. I need to look into it. You can see here what could indicate, and this goes back to that discussion of actual ranges versus theoretical ranges as well. A fishbone is called a fishbone because you can kind of see in a typical scenario, in the best case scenario, you have these nice, relatively evenly spaced out fishbones, basically, roughly perpendicular to the line. They're not actually perpendicular, but they're going the right direction. Pretty close. Your address point, your placed point is pretty close to in front of the road center line where that placed point goes. It kind of looks like the bones of a fish. Kind of see like maybe a thrashing tail down here and like a head right here. How about that? So it's kind of like the bones of a fish. But then you also get these scenarios like this where you can kind of see everything's okay because they're not intersecting. But I can tell you that this placed point is registering a long ways away from its geocoded point, right? So this goes again, if you have a theoretical range that goes from 0, whoops, back that up, 0 to 99 up here. And this house number is 64. 64 geocodes down here. That's one of the things you have to think about with theoretical range management is you're going to kind of get this V pattern in your fishbones instead of these perpendicular ones. This one is more like an actual range here. And that's okay as long as you know that's why you have that. What's going on here is what turns into sort of range saving. You're not necessarily saving range from 64 to 99, but it just so happens that there's no addresses in 64 to 99. And so you have all of these geocoded locations that are here, but there's no addresses to geocode to. Now that may introduce some errors. As if somebody types in, this is 1164, somebody types in 1184 instead of 64 by accident, it's still going to geocode up here, right? And that turns out that that's going to be okay anyways. But imagine in an Next Gen 911 scenario where and I know we haven't talked about this, but I'm just going to make a couple of statements. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, you can feel free to ask questions. But in Next-Gen 911, for call routing decisions, a machine-to-machine interface is going to decide what PSAP a call gets sent to. It's going to do so without the intervention of a human eyeballs who could look at this and go, whoa, wait a minute, that's not right. Let's fix that, right? So if a boundary comes between the block down here, let's say right here, it's going to geocode this address point. If it can't find this address point in its system, it's going to geocode the address point. It's going to put it down here. But if the boundary's up here, it's going to send it to the wrong PSAT because it's geocoding it down here, but the actual address and structure is up here, right? That's what we're trying to avoid by emphasizing data quality concerns in next generation 911 GIS data preparation. Now, the fishbone analysis would demonstrate how that could be causing a problem where any other tool would miss it. And so that's why fishbone, that's one great application of the fishbone analysis and the data quality analysis that comes from it that have real impact on public safety services. Before I move into these other, excuse me, data quality concerns, any questions about fishbones? Okay. Feel free to bring it up at any time. Some other data quality concerns, and then I'm going to hand this over to Mark here after I get through these, and he's going to talk about parsing. Address point duplication should not occur, right? In data sets. Very often it indicates that there probably needs to be some sub-addressing done or some selective, some selecting of address points. Which one's the winner? 112 Gephardt Road here is duplicated. You look at the aerial and you see that it's very possible that there's some sort of like residential and business listing here. And so a review of that may show that we need to have a little bit of sub-addressing done on the barn here because that's where business occurs, but this is where somebody lives. Don't stick a 1/2 on that address number because that would go against my other recommendations, but you may want to have a unit A, all right, or a unit 1, unit 2, whatever, 100. However you do it as an addressing authority, add some distinction for that sub-addressing. An address point not reflected in a road center line is another good tool because what that tells you is that there's some mismatch in the attributes. Yes, you're asking about best practices for sub-addressing. We can certainly do that. Stayed away from letters. Is that a good idea? I don't know that I can offer you an opinion on the best way to do sub-addressing because I've seen a ton of different ways and they're all fine. I think you should, as an addressing authority though, define your structure and stick to it. That's the best advice I think I can give is that if staying away from letters makes sense because you reserve letters for commercial sub-addressing or something like that, that's a good reason to do it. Just be consistent. If you prefer numbers, I've seen that happen too, where somebody, where a jurisdiction would say, I feel like letters can't indicate floor levels. That's a good point. A really good point. People can infer things that are not implied in letters. They might do that if you did numbers too, right? They might think that 11 is on top of 1,000, or 700 is on top of 600, and that may or may not be true, right? So I think it's whatever your reasoning is. I think you should just document it and be consistent with it. What about you? What do you think, Mark? How about your experience? Oh, you're on mute. I'm not hearing you, Mark.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you now.
Okay, cool. My mute was off.
Yep.
So you may have maybe you have a duplex or triplex or quadplex, right? So it's residential, you use A, B, C, D, right? Or maybe you'll have a plaza, which has 5 units, and you'll have unit A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever. But for something bigger than that, right? Like businesses, like Jeff was implying, you may just use numbers, or apartment complexes, condos, mobile homes. You just use numbers for those. But I agree with Jeff. You want to be consistent on how you want to do it. I like the point about you can't use letters with floor numbers unless you're doing then you start mixing 1A, 2B, 2 would be the second floor, 1 would be the first floor. That can be confusing. And in NextGen, they're going to have what they call additional location information, where you can take your sub-addressing to the floor level, to the building level, and you'll be able to use those as well in NextGen. So just be consistent, whatever's going to work best for you and all the authorities that are assigning those.
I'll say that it's even down to the room and seat level, right, on the schema. I don't know who's actually going to maintain room level, but maybe, or seat. Okay, great. Glad we were able to answer that one for you. Okay, address point not reflected in road center line. What that shows is there's a mismatch, which is why we have this picture of 2 different shoes, 2 different socks. Something got misspelled in the streets. There were inconsistent directionals applied between address points, road center lines, inconsistent street types, potentially even missing roads. This has been a tool that's helped us find a lot of places in data for clients where they had an address point, but they didn't have a road that would correspond to that. Now that was shocking to everybody every time that ever happens, but it'll find it if you do this particular check. So you're checking in your address point data to see, again with fishbones. I couldn't create a fishbone here because I couldn't find the matching road center line. Dig in and figure out what the distinctions are, and the next time you make your fishbones, they'll connect. Address point misordered along the road center line. This is the one that's real easy to find with that intersection analysis. Because if it's out of order, then there will be intersections in your fishbones. Road center line digitized direction does not require fishbones to do, but just some symbology. So if you put the arrows on the end point of your road center lines, you see 2 arrows coming together. If you work in the public works department, you might think that's like a water valve. Well, it's not. That's a problem for your digitized direction. And what that means is, in this case, is a great example. This road here needs to be flipped, not this one, because it goes from 8250 to 8499. So it should pick up here and say 8500 to 8799 should be going this way. Instead, the geometry is going this way. The attributes are fine. The attributes don't need to be messed with, but the geometry needs to be flipped.
Yeah, and if you're using any in public safety, especially if you're routing fire trucks or police cars, that's going to be a real issue right there.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm sucking on a cough drop and it's louder than I thought it would be. All right, MSAG has no matching road center line. Now this is where we start getting into Mark's real expertise. So actually, I'm gonna let you talk through this one, Mark.
Okay. MSAGs have been around since probably the late 70s, and we've manipulated the MSAG to do different things. So in this case, you may have a road center line that you have the road center line in your system, but there's nothing in MSAG. Maybe we call it something different in MSAG. Maybe we're using that vanity name or another street alias where maybe we shouldn't be, right? So sometimes we have to fix the MSAG to make it match that road center line, that segment, or the entire road, or we need to fix the GIS side, or sometimes we need to fix both. And some of you may not know what an MSAG is, of why 911 uses it, but basically an MSAG is kind of like a road center line. All those different segments are in the MSAG, and we'll kind of talk about them in a little bit. But it's always a good comparison when you compare your MSAG to your road center line, because in next generation, your road center line is what's going to be answering the questions that currently in 911 the MSAG does for you.
Great. Yeah, it's really a good starting point of any data preparation project to line those up and just make sure they're as consistent as possible. And to note that, you know, something you're probably going to talk about later is that MSAG management is not as cut and dry and simple as we GISers would love it to be, because there's different vendors and many systems that use it that are kind of like live mission critical systems. So they can't just kind of go tweaking things. Yeah, and vendor relationships are different in this space than in GIS for sure. So I'll let you talk about that more later.
Oh yeah.
So the 911 data schemas and standards, I'm sure that a lot of you are aware of these, but I want to make sure. The addressing standard put out by FGDC is a pretty amazing document. It gets very sort of academic at times. It's a little bit dry, but if you really want to understand, excuse me, managing and addressing in GIS data sets, it's a great document. NINA, again, the National Emergency Number Association, has the 911 standards. One of those is the NG911 GIS data model, which puts out the NG911 data schema, and it rides atop definitions given in the CLDXF, which is the Civic Location Data Exchange format, which is not a GIS standard at all, but I highly recommend you understand the contents of the CLDXF so that you can understand why the GIS data model is built the way it is. Mark, I don't know if you had anything to add on that.
No, they're really, and what's really good about NINA is a lot of the work groups, it's all volunteers, and it's volunteers from Wisconsin, maybe public safety, maybe GIS, maybe land management. All over the US, vendors are involved. So these working groups have a great amount of input, a great amount of opinions, great amount of examples, and how we develop and use these standards and information documents and the requirement documents. What's nice about it, you do not have to be a NINA member to download these documents. If you go to the NINA website, go to standards and documents, you can download all these documents and start perusing them and helping you develop your addressing standards. You know, what are the pros and cons of actual, right, ranges versus theoretical, parcel-based versus structure-based. So you can kind of go through this information and put it together and say, this is how we're going to do it because we're following NINA standards. We're following FGDC standards. We're following the CLDXF standards. And then as updates come, you can fine tune your standards because things are changing all the time. You know, Nina started with, you know, this, okay, we're going to come out with these next gen standards, and they had version 1, and then they went to version 2, and then now they're in, you know, version 3. And the GIS data model is going through a big upgrade right now with emergency service boundaries and road center lines. So these standards are developing all the time and getting better and better and better. But you can start looking at your schemas now and start figuring out, how am I going to build these out? And what's really important is you don't want to break your schema right now. Just go, now we're going to start from scratch, because the tax collector uses it. Property appraiser, your CAD in your 911 database uses it in your 911 system. So you don't want to, you know, do something to break an existing relationship with the data.
Yep, that's a great point. And I want to use, actually, let me just this is the FGDC standard. It's titled United States Thoroughfare Landmark and Postal Address Data Standard. USPS Pub 28 talks about road street types. That's an appendix to this, so that would be a useful document for you if you're managing addressing data in GIS. This is the NG91 GIS data model. Probably everybody's seen it. And then the CLDXF, I actually want to go back to that example that you had earlier, Mark, of the subaddress information, right?
Right.
The building, room, seat, that information is actually all driven by the CLDXF.
Correct.
It's in the GIS data model because it's in the CLDXF. And as you point out, they're rewriting CLDXF, and the major item that gets rewritten is called the additional location information field. I believe it turns into 2 or 3 different fields, and I'm not on that group, though I've read the public comment version. So what they're going to wind up with is a little bit different subaddress information in CLDXF that'll then have to be updated in the GIS data model to reflect that.
Right. And they do that to be consistent, which is really good, because it's not like, oh, well, here I'm looking at the CLDXF, I have these 12 subaddress fields, and then you look at the GIS data model and go, wait, there's only 8. Which one's right? They are interconnected, they are linked. So whatever you see in one's going to see in the other. But like Jeff was saying, you know, some places can go to the seat level. Well, that would be great. Like if Jeff and I work in a big office complex and he's in seat 23 and I'm in seat 15, that's really awesome. But what happens when they knock down a wall or they build a conference room and they renumber? So Jeff went from 23 to 10. Well, what if they don't update it in the map, right? Or they don't update it on the phone system that pipes the information to the 911 center?
Yeah.
Well, they're looking for seat 23 to find Jeff who had a heart attack. They're not going to find Jeff at 23. It's now a conference room or a break room or a gym, right? So having to it's nice to have that data, but who's going to maintain it and how timely are those updates going to come into your system? Now, having an apartment number or a floor, that's good stuff, you know, or a building name or a building number, those don't change as often. And those are very helpful for the responders.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say, Mark, is they have a dependency between CLDXF and the data model.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of things that you're going to have to think about to create your own addressing system schema. How does it interact with the Nina model? How does it interact with the schema at your CAD system in your 911 center? How does it interact with the schema in your permitting or asset management system? or your parcel system. You know, Esri has solutions out there. The now deprecated Elgin, the Address Management Pro solution. They all have their own sort of recommendations about schema. So you have to consider all of these things when you create your addressing schema. Because you're the one that's going to have to support all those different outputs out of your maintenance schema. All right, I think this is where I'm going to let you take it away, Mark. Just
All right.
let me know when to advance the slide.
Will do. All right. So in the GIS data model, it really goes into great depth between the CLDXF standard and the next gen GIS data model standard about how important it is to parse your data and why do we need to parse it, right? Well, we're going to be using GIS data differently now in next gen than we've ever used in 911 before. And we have things like streets and roads and boulevards and pre-directionals and post-directionals and all these different things. And a lot of times in MSAG systems, it's in one field. You may be fortunate and have the pre-directional as a separate field, but then the street name, the street type, the post-directional is all crammed into one. Well, if I want to compare that with my GIS database, the GIS database fields are all broken out. So it's trying to like compare apples to oranges. We need to match everything up. So we're going to have something in next gen called PIDAFlow. I know it sounds kind of strange, but it's presence, information, data, format, location, object. It's coming up with that consistency. This is how we're going to have our data come through the system. So when it compares it to another system, it looks the same. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jeff, please. So, and it goes right back to that FGDC standard that Jeff was talking about and how important that is. And it also relates to the postal standards. Well, we've used postal standards for years when it comes to the MSAG for street types, pre-directional, post-directional. But CAD systems traditionally were created a long time ago for some of them, and they were using older databases. And our CAD may say, okay, Main Avenue is AVE in our MSAG system. Maybe it's Main Avenue in our GIS. But in our CAD system, it only allows 2 characters. So they have to kind of strip off the E to use AV instead of AVE. And that's part of their schema. They strip that stuff off to be able to use it in a CAD system. But the data model, when it talks about parsing, it goes into detailed elements. And there's more elements now than there were before. So Jeff, if you want to hit the next one, please. So we're going to be breaking down in the next gen, we're going to be going into 8 different, what they call street name element fields, okay? So you're going to have something called a pre-modifier, which is, for example, the example that's on your screen is the word alternate in the road name, alternate route 8. So alternate will be what they call a pre-modifier. It'll go into a separate field, right? Pre-directional, pretty standard, right? North, south, east, west. But in next gen, we're spelling that out. We're not going to use the abbreviation of N any longer. A pre-type is a new field for us. Avenue in the word Avenue A is going to be a pre-type because avenue is really a street type, right? But it's the first word in that street name. Or county route in the word county route 88 is going to be now called a pre-type field. They added a what they call a pre-type separator. This is one of my favorite ones because there's a lot of places in, I know in Florida, in North Carolina, in Wisconsin, that have streets like Avenue of the Americas, Avenue of the Carolinas, Avenue of the, we've never really had a place for the of the before. So now we're going to have a separate field for that. Street name, pretty obvious, right? Street name post type would be the street type, avenue, boulevard, road. But we're not going to use those postal abbreviations anymore. We're spelling them out. Post directional, again, pretty standard, but spelled out now in the future. And then one of my favorite ones is post modifier. It's amazing how many areas have a street name like East End Avenue. And now they've extended that road across the street for a new subdivision. So instead of giving it a new street name, they just added the word extended to the end. Well, we don't really have a place for that. Well, now we do. And everything in NextGen is going to be spelled out when it comes to letters, okay? So Jeff, if you want to head to the next slide for me, please. Okay, so here's some examples from Wisconsin. I've looked at a lot of MSAGs from the state of Wisconsin for some of our clients and potential clients. So Lake of the Woods Road. Okay, so we have that of the, right? We have lake, we have woods, and we have road. All different pieces, they're going to go into different fields. On the Rocks Road. That makes me want to drink, doesn't it? Because it's like, on the rocks, baby, we're good. So on the would be the street type separator, rocks would be the street name, road would be the post type. Ironwood Road Extension or extended. Again, this would be that post modifier position. And then there's a lot of streets that are like the and a word, the orchard, the place, the plaza, the mall. So the is going to be a, whoops, that's okay. Pre-type separator, and then orchard in this case would be the street name. So just a little bit ways of breaking it out, but it's going to be a lot better than our current MSAG system and our current street name field in our GIS. We're going to break these out into different fields. So next slide, sir. And then we're going to have 4 address number element fields. Something different, because right now we put everything in one house number field, right? Well, now we're going to do it a little bit different. So here's some examples. In Hawaii, Hawaii uses like 5-1234. Well, Jeff talked about using those hyphens. That's not a good thing for a database. So we're going to put that 5- in a separate field. It's going to be called the address number prefix. Address number, pretty easy to figure out, right? Address number suffix. Remember those 1/2 addresses that we don't like? It's going to go into a separate field called a address number suffix. And then if you use milepost or like mile markers, you can use this in place of or in addition to an address number. So if you have addresses off maybe an interstate or some of those county routes that are really long that may use milepost, right? You can use that. So go ahead and hit the next slide, sir, and I'll give you some more examples. So here are some examples right from Wisconsin's databases. So M00300 is a house number. Well, we talked about not using letters, right, as a best practice. And we talked about not using leading zeros. So in this case, we're going to put the M00 in the address number prefix field, and then 300 would be the address number. Same thing with S02700. S0 is going to be moved, and then 2700 would be the address number. N14900, we're just going to move the N to its own field. Jeff, if you hit one more, a couple more examples. So again, another leading zero with the E, and then a W. So again, it's going to help us break things out. So when we do comparisons, trying to do a one-to-one match, it's going to work out a lot better. But Wisconsin does some different things that I haven't seen in other parts of the country. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but like Jeff said, a lot of your history came from different areas back in the day. So this will make it a little bit easier for your systems to be able to digest what you have to do. Okay, next slide, sir. Subaddresses. We've talked about this subaddress a little bit already, right? But there's 6 subaddresses. Buildings are really important if it's a building names, building numbers, building letters. So that would be a good thing, right? Let's see, the next one would be additional location. So the West Wing at the White House. Anything that you can add to help a responder would benefit greatly in your GIS data for the responder to be able to get that information. Floor is a good one. So you have a multi-story building, could be an apartment complex, condos, high rise in downtown where you have businesses. Floor number is very important. Hotels have things like mezzanine levels, lobby levels. You could build those in there into the floor as well. Units, pretty standard. You can use suites, apartments, penthouse, whatever you call them. You can go to the room level, if you know what room they're in and what seat. And again, like Jeff and I were talking about, you guys were asking about, it's hard to maintain that room and seat level because sometimes it changes. Sometimes even the unit numbers change. Like we had issues with strip plazas in Pinellas County where maybe there was a strip plaza and it had 5 units. Well, maybe there was a big unit, number 5, that had been vacant for a while. Well, the landlord or the owner of the property is like, I need to get somebody in there. I need some income, right? Got to pay the mortgage, got to pay for fix the parking lot, whatever. They break it into 2 separate units and decide to add a unit 6. But they don't tell anybody except the Postal Service, who will deliver mail anywhere. They don't tell 911, right? We kind of need to know, the tax collector needs to know, property appraiser needs to know. So when they send out tax bills and all those other things. So really important, but again, hard to maintain. But if you have a good workflow, you have a good relationship with apartment complexes and condos and businesses, hey, when your floor plan changes, you need to let us know so we can update our data. Next slide, sir. So MSAG, for those who are not familiar with what an MSAG is what we call a master street address guide. We started using this in the 70s and 80s when we started moving to what they call now enhanced 911. We added selective routers coming from the phone company. We added circuits for not just voice, but also data, the information that the dispatchers see on their screen when they answer a 911 call. 911 uses this to route calls to the proper PSAP. We use something called an ESN, Emergency Service Number. And what happens is it's kind of like a road center line. So it'll have 100 to 199 Main Street. And for that, it'll have a community name. It's not a postal name. It's not, it's not for mailing stuff. It could be because of that's the fire area, the law enforcement town, something along those lines. We have community names. And then we have an ESN. So what happens is the information from the phone providers. So for example, Jeff moved to Kentucky. He's got a new house phone number. So the phone company, whoever his provider is, finds out, okay, this is his house address. Let's run it against the MSAG to see, does his house number fit in this range on this street in this community in Kentucky where Jeff lives? If it does, it knows, okay, this phone number is associated with this ESN. Jeff calls 911, it goes and says, yep, this phone number goes to this ESN, which goes to this PSAP. And it's in the system. Now, if he changes his address or moves, then it would have to do something different. But if you don't have access to this MSAG, it might be a good idea to contact the 911 office and say, hey, can we get a copy of your MSAG? And then you can do a comparison with what they have compared to what you have in your GIS data. Because like Jeff was talking about, there's some things in the MSAG that aren't on the road center line or vice versa. Now, there are some things that might need to be taken out. Like we have a lot of what we call PANIs, which are phone numbers associated with a cell tower that will give us the information to go to the right PSAP. And then we wait for the wireless call to give us what we call a rebid to give us better information. Okay, next slide, sir. So here's what a MSAG looks like. It kind of looks like an Excel document, right? So it has something, it has a low range, a high range. Some of these have parity, just like your road center line does. But in our MSAG, we're not always really good about putting, oh, this is the odd only group, or this is even only group. Most times when we put it in, it defaults to both. So it's not really going to match up well with your road center line. Maybe we should fix these things. It has the street name, it has the community name, it has the state. It also gives you what they call the ESN, right? Because we need the ESN. Because that's how we route the calls. Very important for us to do what we need to do with this. But this is all what they call tabular data. It's non-spatial. So we can't do any topology checks. We can't look and see if it fits in a certain boundary, or if it has a right address point based on this information. It's a range. It's kind of like the road center line, like I said. So Jeff, you want to hit the next slide? Let's talk about alley. Alley is the information the dispatcher gets on their call taking screen from their phone system. The alley is kind of like your address points. So for Jeff's new house that he moved into, we have an address point for his corner lot, like we talked about, right? So in the alley, it has Jeff's phone number, Jeff's ESN, it'll have Jeff's name, it'll show it's a residential line, and it'll have his address and the responding fire department, the responding law enforcement, and EMS. Again, this information can be very useful for you in GIS to be able to run a comparison. Okay, we have this alley database that has all these addresses. Well, is there a corresponding address point? Well, if there is, great. But what if there's not? Are we missing something in our GIS data? Or maybe our alley's wrong. Again, our alley and MSAG have been around since the 70s and 80s. Who goes in and cleans that data up? Like when Jeff moves from Kentucky and he moves back to Texas, he's going to go back to Houston, right? Well, his phone number is not going to be any good anymore. Does it come out of the alley database? Well, the phone provider is supposed to do deletes out of the system. But do we ever check that? Do we know if it's deleted? If I know Jeff personally, I could look in the database and go, hey, Jeff, how's Houston? Oh, it's awesome. Hey, do you still have the same phone number? No, I turned that off because I moved from Kentucky. Well, it's in our database, right? Maybe I have the authority to go in and get rid of it, or I can tell the phone company, hey, Jeff moved. You need to get this out of my stuff, right? If you don't have the alley database, talk to the 911 office. Run a comparison. Maybe you're missing some addresses on your GIS side, or maybe you can help 911 clean up their alley database, which would be awesome. So next slide, sir. So again, it's kind of like a big Excel spreadsheet. It'll give us the phone number, it'll give us the customer's name, it'll tell us if it's a residential, a business line, it'll give us all the address data, the ESN, the city, or I'm sorry, the community, and the state. But again, non-spatial data. Okay, it's all tabular. Now, can you compare, tabular data to your GIS data? Yeah, tabular to tabular, sure you can. And it's a really good place to start. There was a NINA document that came out in 2009. So it's, let's see, 12 years old now, right? That kind of walks you through how to synchronize your GIS databases with these legacy MSAG and alley databases. Some places have done it, some places haven't. If you haven't, now's maybe a good time as you start that transition to next gen 911. All right, next slide, sir. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to you for this case study, which is a really good case study, by the way. I love this example.
Great. I always love bringing in any kind of Yoda. So the Yoda on this one. Master address database. Get my, there we go. So we did, this is from a project that we did for the city of San Jose up in Silicon Valley. And their city auditor did a report, then found out that they had 9 addressing databases across their enterprise. And then it resulted in these islands of data. And I'm sure if you are in a city or a county, you actually have very similar islands of data, but you don't realize it. Basically, what they found was that there was the permitting database, which had addresses in it. There was the utility billing database, which had addresses in it. There was the registrar of voter, which had addresses in it. The public works asset management system, which had addresses in it. And then none of these addressing databases agreed or had the same data in them, right? They were not consistent. Go back in your mind to that data quality ball, and the 5th dimension of data quality is consistency across systems. And that's what the city auditor found and convinced the city council to put some money towards normalizing so that there would be one master address database with, in this case, they had 12 FTE maintaining these 9 address databases. And the idea of the auditor was that if there is a master address database, then there should be many fewer FTE maintaining that master address database than there are maintaining 9 addressing databases across the enterprise. So we did a project where we put them through a process called the address comparison evaluation process that we have, where we treated their GIS database of about 250,000 addresses as master. We took their public works 250,000 addresses, some of which there was a significant amount of overlap between these two, but there wasn't 100%. We added in the voter roll. We added in the utility billing address database. We used a commercial direct mailing address database. And what we identified was 150 additional candidates that were not in the master. And then we conducted a weighted analysis to establish a trust factor. But before we were able to do that analysis, we had to parse each of those databases, normalize them so that they were looking apples to apples, compare them, and then again, evaluating them is that weighted analysis. Then we developed the master address database by geolocating those additional candidates, adding them to the existing master or the supposed master, and then delivered the database for city maintenance. The weighted analysis was the most fascinating part of the project because what we did was we weighted each of the database sources. Amanda was their permitting database. Allie was the database that Mark just referred to. A commercial mailing database, a county's database, a mobile home database that was separate, situs addresses out of the parcels. Their CAD system used what are called SPADs, a sewer utility billing database here, the voter roll. So what we said was the voter roll doesn't particularly get vetted well, so it's a weight of 1. But the Alley and the commercial mailing database get vetted very well, so that it got a weight of 5. Permitting database is very well vetted, got a weight of 3. And they said the county address database is pretty trustworthy, so we weighted it 4. Every time a given address, like 3591 Pine Ridge Way, occurred, excuse me, it got that that database got a 1, And then we multiplied the weight of that database into a confidence factor, right? So that confidence factor then boiled down to this is actually a confidence factor. And what we effectively did was, if it wasn't above a 0.5 or higher, then we said we don't have confidence that this address is legitimate, though it may be. And we didn't place those addresses into the database, but the ones that were above a 0.5 did get added. In the end, we wound up adding 138 address points net to bring the total to, that should be 368. And created the enterprise gold standard for address points, removing then through our review process 20,000 erroneous addresses that we had found in their existing 250,000 address points that were no longer valid addresses. We delivered that 368,000 address database as the final deliverable of the project, and the city is currently integrating all of that data into its other systems so that there is a master address database, and they're maintaining that master address database. So it's a good example of the use case of a master database of any sort, but particularly for addressing, because it's used across many IT systems, can bring about efficiencies of both maintenance and consistency of the data. And so it's something that I like to talk about because the idea of having a master address database is something that everybody in a government position should think about, creating a master address database that then drives all of the other systems that use those point of service delivery addresses. And so that concludes today's Addressing a Practical Guide workshop. Hope it's been really useful for you. I'd love to entertain any kind of questions or discussion that should be had. Again, feel free to raise your hand if you want to talk, or chat in the chat if you want to ask any additional questions. You know, you've got a week full of good stuff slated here at WLIA. We'll be back making some presentations ourselves. So thanks for joining us this afternoon, and everybody have a great week at the conference.
Yeah, we have a little time for any questions. If anybody wants to either type it in or just unmute and ask the question directly of Jeff or Mark. And don't be shy.
I was going to say, now they're being quiet. They were interacting earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
Put them to sleep with that last story.
Well, you guys were so efficient. You cut them off at the pass. That's what happened.
That's what it is.
We anticipated their questions.
Well, I guess I have a question. I mean, that I really like the idea of having some kind of a like a work group or a committee to start dealing with addressing and things like that. And from your experiences, I guess it would be interesting to see. I mean, sometimes we, within the GIS world, or within our little niche, we can kind of be preaching to the choir, and we can all agree to something. But then there's managers and higher ups that can create challenges for us to work more efficiently together. Is there some strategy? Does it help to have like fire chiefs or 911 directors or mayors or something to start kind of saying, this is an important committee, or this is an important group, and we're going to start looking for them? How do you, Mark, you Pinellas County, how did you go about getting the buy-in from the higher ups?
Yeah, when we started with our addressing authority group, I had talked to people on the phone, I had emailed people, but I had never met them face to face, So when we invited them for the first time, we brought my director, who was the director of 911. We brought our PSAP director as well. And it kind of grew from there. And we were like, okay, well, you guys need to go back to your agencies. You need to go back to, like, for example, the city of Largo. Go talk to, tell them what we're doing with this group and see if they have any issues with any addresses. Ask the fire chiefs, ask the police chiefs, ask the public works people, right? So everybody, we had our main meeting, and then they kind of went back to their agencies and asked questions. And then the next time we would meet, they would bring up questions like, hey, we're having an issue with this certain street. And I would say, okay, well, let's look at the range on this street. Let's look at the boundary. Let's look at the MSAG, and really delved into some issues. And of course, we had a really good relationship with fire and EMS because we dispatched those agencies for decades.
Right.
With the police side, it was kind of newer. And then, sometimes fire chiefs would retire or a police chief would retire. And we'd say, hey, bring your chief or bring your deputy chief to the next meeting, and just make them feel welcome.
I think what Mark's telling you is a true story. In my experience, fire chiefs actually like each other and get along. Mm-hmm. Police chiefs, on the other hand, are just, it's nature of their work. They're much more suspicious of everything around them. And so they don't really work together per se, but sheriffs and police chiefs, they meet together enough that they know who each other are and don't want to be upstaged by the other. So if you can get one of those and have him start talking, her start talking about, the amazing work they're doing over here at this other group, then that goes a long way. But I would say if you don't have a group like that, go to your fire chief, go to a fire chief and say, hey, because their work brings them together and the law enforcement work does less of that, but they're in mutual aid anyways, and they're answering each other's calls for service all the time anyways, just because it's the nature of the discipline. And they're, in my experience, a great way to get a group started. And if you get a group of fire chiefs talking about it, then it'll percolate down to like the city manager who goes, hey, I want you to support the chief over here, addressing authority, and go to this meeting with them or whatever. And then what I've also found is that just like with GIS nerds like me and like most of this group, is that when you can connect anybody to that life-saving mission and message, they're like, oh, okay, this is important work. I want to do it.
Yeah, and a lot of times, like Jeff said, the sheriff and the police chiefs meet maybe every month or every quarter. See if you can find out, hey, how can we get invited over there to talk about what we're doing with GIS and how we're starting to plan for next gen 911? What are we doing? Talk to the 911 director and say, hey, do they have a fire chiefs meeting? Oh yeah, they have one every quarter. Well, hey, do you go? Well, yeah. Well, can you see if I can get on the agenda and just tell them what we're doing in our county for GIS? And maybe, hey, when you guys are driving back from a fire scene and you see a new business and it's not on the map, hey, drop us an email, give us a phone call, right? Send me a text, because they're the eyes and ears that are out there. And that's why I liked working with the Postal Service, because their postal people would send pictures to our coordinator for our region, and they would forward it to me saying, hey, here's a mailbox with this address. Is it valid? And I'm like, nope. Somebody just popped the mailbox out there and the Postal Service is delivering, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's another good point, Mark, is that if you can tell them there's a way to fix it whenever their routing goes wrong, they're on it, especially fire departments are on it. They're like, oh wait, and then if you can actually get to them to have the conversation, you just ask them, like, tell me your top 10 biggest location problems. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to go reference a map book. They can tell you, boom, 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 here's where it is, right? And then you say, okay, great. Can you bring that to this meeting with these other people over here that can help actually resolve that? And they're usually happy to do that because it makes their life easier as well.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas put a question out there. What kind of resources are out there for addressing authorities who might want to migrate their addressing standard to the NG 911 standard, but may lack the resources and or expertise to do so?
Yeah, so in terms of like what you could read or bone up on to learn how to do it yourself, there's lots of great resources from Nina. Um, Datamark does monthly webinars that also would help you learn about what you need to do in order to get the data ready. I know there's lots of states, and I'm not as familiar with what Wisconsin has for it or not, but there are lots of states that have kind of state resources as far as standards and um, things, projects that they're following, grant opportunities, funding opportunities of that where you can just sort of define what needs to be done and how much it would cost to get it done, and then apply for the funding. And I would think that would be the kind of resources that would be most impactful for, sounds like your description, Thomas.
Right, and I would make a, you know, a point out the WLIA standards for address points and street center lines. We've done a lot of work to get that as kind of a broader base address point and street center line data. It's not just specific to NG 911, but a lot of other applications like voter registration, permitting, those types of things. The idea behind it being that it can easily be ETL'd into a NG 911, or I guess we would call Wisconsin NINA standard eventually for DMA. Another resource too would be the special interest group meetings that we have, and kind of having a discussion and talking about that a little bit more. There's a lot of us in the community have done pieces of this or all of this, so we could share some of our expertise with that as well. And finally, the other point is that it's not so much migrating, and Jeff and Mark also, you can comment on this, but it's not so much migrating what you're doing right now, but making sure that your maintenance models that you have, or your processes, are capturing some of that additional attributes, or formalizing how you place a point, you know, whether it's being on the center of the building or at the location of the entrance, or those types of things, and be able to publish it out to a uniform standard.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is that what you're not trying to do in this process is going to be to sort of create a 911 data set and this data set and that data set. But what you have to do is thoughtfully sort of consider, what does my maintenance schema need to look like where I can actually turn this one data set into 5 different data sets all at once. And one is for NextGen 911, one is for my CAD system, one is for my permitting system, et cetera, et cetera. That's that master address database idea, is not that you have 5 masters, but you have one, but you have a set of business processes and tools that will help you output the right data set at the right time when an update's needed. It's a really good point.
Exactly. There was another question, it looks at, and it said, is there a database that the post office maintains? There is. It's an act of Congress to try to get that database. I've never been able to get it, but I made sure that as I made changes to my MSAG, or we made changes, added a new subdivision or changed the street name or something along those lines, that I would make sure I updated the post office. There is if you talk to your local regional post office representative, they'll say, well, we can't share our database. Or, hey, yeah, we don't have a zip code boundary. They do, but they just don't want to share it. They don't want to play well with others, it seems like. But if you share with them, maybe they can do some comparisons with theirs, and maybe they'll say, hey, we're missing a whole subdivision, or, hey, do you know you're missing some of these addresses? Kind of like the case study that Jeff was talking about, where they may have some things that you don't have, or they may give you some things and you go, this isn't a valid address. I've done all the research. I've talked to other addressing authorities. This does not exist. So maybe they can fix some of their stuff as well.
I'll point you to a tool called Smarty Streets. And Smarty Streets actually takes that address, that big national mailing address with database, which is basically like the USPS actually puts it out. And anybody who wants it can get it. It is an act of Congress to find it and actually fill out the paperwork and get it. And then it's an act of Congress to take what you get and turn it into something you could actually use, because it's delivered. Imagine how many addresses the US Postal Service delivers to every month. Hundreds of millions across the country. It's delivered in like a fixed width, what's it called? Not a CSV. Yeah, it's not a CSV if it's fixed width, but in a width delimited file, right? It's basically the text file, but it's huge and it's super hard to like make sense of. And so there are this one tool I'm talking about, Smarty Street, exists, and there's many others. Maybe not many, but there are others out there as well that actually take it in on a whatever basis they take it in on, and then they format the database and then they turn it into useful services. Like for Smarty Street, and I bring that up purposefully because I think you can use it up to like 50 validations. You can type in one address and it'll come back and say, that's a mailable address, or that is a valid address, but it hasn't been active in the mail system for 6 months or more. So which is pretty useful. And if you're willing to do one-offs, you could use it for free. If you pay them a little bit of a subscription fee, you can have up to XYZ, so many, whatever their pricing is. I don't know about that, but that's a tool that you can use. And I've used it in our work. We actually did in this San Jose project, use Smarty Street to validate everything against at the end of it that we came out with before we placed everything. We did the weighted analysis, came up with our list of confidence points, and then we put that list through Smarty Street. And then we took out anything where it said it was unmailable, or you couldn't validate it, basically. We took those out as an additional measure just to make sure that it was as clean as possible. So there are some tools like that. They're most expensive, but sorry.
I guess I just wanted to share an example too, that the post office can also be a big obstacle. We had a situation where one community renamed a street, used to be ABC Corporate Drive or something like that, and they named it to Thompson Drive. And they reassigned new addresses and everything. Well, one of the factories companies on that street absolutely refuses to use the new address. And this has been going on for almost 10 years. And so anything that they mail, they set out as 675 ABC Corporate Drive. And the post office has told us we have to deliver their mail. We don't care whether it's an official address or not. This is what they told us, and we have to deliver the mail to them.
I ran into that brick wall many times when I worked for the Houston 911 network. I'd call them up and say, if you would just not do this, then it wouldn't be seen as legitimate.
Yeah.
They'd said the same thing to me. Sorry. All I care about is putting the parcel in the box.
Yep. But if they called 911 and gave that address on ABC, Corporate Street or whatever, we'd be like, it's not in our system.
Yeah.
Now, some CAD systems you have the ability to almost create a street alias, so they can use the new address or the old address and it converts to the new address so it maps and the responders can find it.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not ideal, but it's a workaround.
Yeah,
for public
it's a headache.
safety. Yes.
You have to know about those situations for that to work.
Yeah.
Exactly. You have to know about it. That's right.
And sometimes you find out about those after the emergency.
That's right.
Right. And the thing is, we've always tried to, talk to the, if we're going to change an address and we say, we're changing the whole street, we're changing the address, whatever. And they're like, oh, I don't want to change because I understand, but this is life safety. This is public safety. Do you want to be liable for an employee at this business if they keel over and have a heart attack and somebody calls 911 and says ABC Corporate Drive and we can't find them and they die? The liability is on you as a company, not on 911, because we changed your address, right?
Yep.
So Sometimes you throw out that liability word and negligence, and sometimes it gets through, but not all the time.
Let's see.
Anything else out there?
There was another comment. Curtis said, in an ideal world, there is a single correct source of truth, but not in the real world, where multiple conflicting database and versions of databases exist. Is there a best resolution pathway to map free text addresses, as in from concatenating all address fields in another table to fully specify next-gen CLDXF and ordering matches? There are multiple possible variants. I don't think there is, there's not a tool or like a thing that I can point you to that will do what you're asking for, to my knowledge. The variants and the multiple variants, possible variants, is a good point as well, is that parsing of names calls for judgment, and the people who have to make those judgments are the addressing authorities. And so, you know, how does the Spanish name, French name would probably be more relevant for you guys. A French name of avenue that's intended not really to say avenue, but to sound like, you know, rue. It's really intended to sound like rue instead of avenue. And, you know, how does that get parsed? Addressing authority has to decide that. And so it may be different in different places. I don't know. Are you aware of any tool that could do that, Mark?
No. That would be $1 million business, though.
That would
If
be.
you could come up with a tool that does that, right? Like one-stop shopping kind of thing.
But on the flip side of that is if you start to build a centralized database, then it's a matter of these multiple agencies kind of starting to adopt it and starting to refer to that source of data and have some input into it. I don't know if this gets exactly to Curtis's point or question, but if you start building like a master street name table and then have a resource where people can put in new names, or a policy that basically says you have to give us a resolution, you know, that was passed by the village board or the city board or whatever it is, and get it recorded, and then have some little tools that allow you to show, you know, how is it structured so that we enter it properly in the database, and only that name will then be available to everybody else. It takes some work, but I mean, I think a lot of communities, especially villages and some cities, are looking for an easier path to deal with this, and sometimes the counties can kind of bring them all together. A suggestion, a thought. Again, these are things that we should have more conversations about.
Yeah, definitely things to consider. Like, you know, Jeff was talking about the planning. You know, how do we want to do this as a county with all these villages and all these addressing authorities?
Yes.
You know, let's put our heads together, and you guys would have some great examples of things like Jeff was saying, rue, and, you know, here's a county route and we have addresses. Do we need to readdress this entire road to make it more addressable for next gen as we move forward? So
Yeah, united voices are always more effective and heard than separate, disparate ones.
true.
Any other questions, comments? Nobody wanted to actually just unmute and pipe in? Come on now.
Well, great. Well, guys, thank you so much. This was really informative, very helpful. I'm sure it will foster additional discussions as we move forward.
Good, hope so. Been my pleasure, and I'm sure Mark's as well.
Exactly. Thank you very much for having us. We appreciate it. And there's, you know, Jeff's contact information, my contact information. I'm doing a presentation on Thursday afternoon, so I might see some of you again. So have a great week with this conference.